So hello everyone, my name is Ayman Omar. So I want to share with you some of my experience in the humanoids. I will talk a little bit about the past and maybe present and future of this technology. So at the beginning, I will introduce myself. My name is Ayman Omar. I'm founder and CEO of Winroll RTS, which is a consultation company. And I'm also like a junk researcher and part-time lecturer at Boston University. Actually, this is where I get my PhD in 2012, and I was assistant professor at Boston University for 5 years. And just 5 years ago, I established my consultation company. So actually, it's not company, not a big company. It's just only me. So don't speak that I have a staff or I'm like a big office or something like that. So I started my experience in robotic research, mainly in humanoid development since 2004. It's almost 20 years ago. I started since I came to Japan in 2004, I joined Waseda University and I started my research in the field of robotics. So, and I established my company, Winroll RTS, for robotic consultation because my dream actually to see the technology that I developed in Japan back in my home country in Sudan, in East Africa. So my company is trying to link Japanese company with like startup and like institute in the Middle East and Africa. Okay. So maybe like the topics of humanoid robot. It's a quite hot topic these days. Like now you can see a lot, big trend about humanoid robot. And actually, it's not something new. It has been going on for almost many years. Like there is a lot of development in this field. And actually, Japan is very famous, like about the robot technology. It's going back into history. Like it was coming from the animation. Maybe you are familiar with Japanese animation that always characterize this kind of robot. Like one of the famous one is Astro Boy, Sasujin 28. this comes some kind of like very famous like robot like characters. Most they show robots as friendly or maybe like something like superheroes. And this actually which encourage especially the old generation about this field of technology, how like to develop those kind of great technology. So one of the first humanoid development happened in 1973. This is actually a long time ago. This is considered to be the first humanoid robot. It was developed in Waseda University called Wabots, which is Waseda robot. This actually the robot with two legs. It can walk. Actually, one step took almost like 45 seconds. So it was very slow at that time. Even you can see here in the middle, this actually is the cameras. At that time, the cameras were actually very big. You cannot place the cameras on the head because it was very huge. I can say like almost bigger than this computer. It was very huge cameras at that time. But this robot was able to speak, communicate, interact with people, can like grab some object. And this actually is a Professor Ichiro Kato. He was the inventor of this robot, and he developed so many humanoid robots at that time. So at that, in the 70s and 60s, humanoid robots considered to be something people they didn't believe in this kind of technology. Even many of his colleagues they think that this kind of stupid research, how we can just develop a device that can walk, is something like they consider impossible. But actually, he did so many research in this field. And this is my professor, he's my supervisor, Professor Atsu Takanishi. He was his student and he continued his research in developing like many humanoids. So until now, he's still like a professor. He's going to retire maybe in 2 or 3 years, but he developed a lot of humanoid in his lab. So I joined in 2004. This is actually, this is me 20 years ago. I was still young at that time. So when I joined the group who was developing this robot. It's called Wabian 2 because we have Wabian 1. It was a big robot, but Wabian 2 was almost like a human-sized robot. And we have many robots at that time. So Wabian, that's the one can walk. We have a robot called WE, is a kind of emotional robot that can show some emotional expression. And we have a musician robot also. This all like humanoid were developed in Takanishi laboratory. So our aim at that time that we wanted like to develop human robot as a human partner. This more than 20 years ago. So our image in the future that we want to have humanoid that could be like a human partner. So our aim to have a robot that can walk in the human environment, can be like an analyze and surrounding, interact with people. And actually, this kind of research was demanded by the Japanese public because Japan is an aging society and there is a great demand for this kind of technology. So this is the robot that we were developing in my group. So Wabian 2R, it can walk similar to human. This is actually, at that time, most of the robot cannot walk like a human, but this one almost can walk like a human. And this is actually another research about a robot that can interact with the surrounding. So this robot have a lot of like sensors. It can interact it by sound, by like touch. And we combine like both robot Wabian, which can walk, and the emotional robot into a new robot, like a fully expression robot. So this robot can make a full expression using the face, the hand, arm, everything. So because our image, like if the robot can show expression, it can interact with people. So it can be more friendly. People will not be afraid. If the people are happy, he can show happiness. If people are like sad, he can also show his sadness to them. And this actually some also other humanoid in Waseda University. This is actually like 21 developed by another professor. The aim of this robot is actually to help elderly people at home. And we have also another robot that can interact. This also a long time ago, before like the current advancement in AI. So this robot also can interact with people. Maybe I need to move a little bit faster. Is okay? Okay. Okay. So actually, like more than 15 years ago, when I was PhD student, there was a lot of like expectation about humanoid. People were thinking that, okay, humanoid maybe is going to be the future. There were many companies and many research groups that focusing in this field, and people they were having very high expectation of this technology. Maybe like at the time we have Ashimo. Like, okay, this is Ashimo developed by Honda, was considered one of the advanced humanoid robot at that time, and there was very high expectation. Even like the JAXA, which is the Japan Aerospace Agency, they had a plan to send humanoid to the moon. So this was in 2009 when they make the announcement, and people were very optimistic about this technology. They would think, okay, we can send humanoid to the moon, and even like my professor, he just asked me to make like my PhD research on how that we can develop a humanoid robot that we can send to the moon. So this is actually from my PhD research. I was trying to analyze the walking motion based on moon gravity. So actually, we have very high expectations about how we can like use humanoid at that time. But actually, everything changed in 2011 because of the great earthquake in 2011 and the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Because actually, when we talk about humanoid and we think, okay, humanoid can do very like advanced things. But when we have the disaster at the nuclear plant, actually, no one could go there. And people, they said, okay, we can send a robot. But we couldn't find a robot that can do even simple tasks like open the door, like turn down the valves, maybe make some switch, make some simple connection. There was no robot at that time. So actually people are thinking, okay, how actually we can send robot to the moon and we cannot solve simple problem on the earth. And that's why like the whole perspective changed. And even there was a competition in the US. They said, okay, let's maybe use humanoid for very simple tasks in a kind of emergency response scenarios similar to the one that happened in Fukushima. And they make some kind of very simple like tasks for groups. Said, okay, you can use a humanoid robot to make very simple tasks. And many groups, they participated. Even you can see that the robot does not look like a human. So that's why people, they shifted their attention. Instead of like, we design a robot, instead of looking like a human, we have to focus on the task. And this is actually what the challenge had show us. And from us, we also changed our perspective and we designed a new robot in technology laboratory, which can be like used for response, similar response. So the robot will have 4 legs. It can be also changed to 2 legs. It can maybe climb the stair, walks in narrow environment, walk in a kind of debris. So this actually I show now the research, but what about the robot in the real market? This maybe in Japan, we have two famous examples, which is Ashimo by Honda and Pepper by SoftBank. So Ashimo actually was one of the famous humanoid robot at that time, and it was considered one of the highly advanced. And there was high expectation about this robot, but at the end, the company did not sell this robot or even release it to the public. It was just only showed in their like advertisement or maybe in some like demonstration, but it was not released to the public. Like Pepper actually was released to the public and it was on sale. I think some of you maybe have seen this robot in some shops, but actually like 3 years ago, the company, they stopped the production of this robot because there was not enough sales. And this maybe gives a question like, what about the future? Can we like see humanoid working around us? I think we still like now with the current trend, especially we can see that the OpenAI figure robot and also the Tesla robot, people have high expectation, but I think we still in the early, we still have to wait and see like what actually this technology will bring us. So I think based on my experience of what I learned from human, I think like humanoid is very good research like platform because we can analyze like the performance and we can develop very high advanced technology from this kind of research. But when we develop humanoid, we have to focus mainly on the application, not on just making the robot looks like a human. Because sometimes when companies they try to make the robot looks like a human, then they end up have very complex machine, but with no like real application. So we have to focus more on the application. And I think maybe humanoid have the similar trend like the way that we develop aircraft, because in the throughout history, people they try to develop aircraft that looks like bird, but the real aircraft does not look like bird. Like this mostly like learned from experiment, and I think humanoid similar like currently. I think you have developed this role. So like the company TX when they like develop like humanoid for their population, but with the development, they have a robot does not look like humanoid. So I think maybe that's a good way of to develop advanced robot. I think that's the end of my talk, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Eamon. Thank you. Okay, yeah. So yeah, I'm quite familiar with that robot. As some may know, I was the former head of engineering for TX, so I did work a lot on both those robots. All right, so let's move on to our second speaker, Joseph Isozaki. Oh yeah, does anyone have any questions for Ayman?
Okay, at our time, like our lab is focused on the development of the hardware. So we were not focusing on the AI or maybe computer science part. But other professors, of course, like we have other professors in our department, they are focusing more on AI because in robots sometimes it's very difficult to focus on all like the part, especially like designing, programming, and AI development. That's why in academia we'll find different professor, different branches, and different focus. Okay, I think there's a difference between like academic approach and companies from business approach because companies they focus more like on developing product for the market, But academia, they focus more on having new knowledge and new theories. And that's why like you find many research group in academia, in university, they focus on just developing new theories or new techniques. But companies, they try to use those techniques. Mostly they collaborate. Sometimes they collaborate with academia when taking this kind of new advanced knowledge and making some kind of product that they can sell to the market. So mostly there is no competition between academia and companies.
Like I'm thinking just like for example, Boston Dynamics made I forgot the name of the group, but like it's all mathematical model.
Yeah, mini spot.
Spot, yeah. Like there's no AI involved.
Yes.
And from a research perspective, how will like did they just end like I'm just thinking how difficult it will be. But like you said, maybe it's just technique, looking at the technique perspective. Not focusing on just the end result.
Yeah, I think like Boston Dynamics approach, they focus more on experimentation because even the CEO, the founder, Mark, I don't remember the name, Mark. Okay, like he is actually like his approach. He said like he presented in many conferences that they test the robot several times. Even sometimes they can't break the robot. Even they show some videos about how they test the robot and break it. That's the way actually they try to develop the performance of their robots. So maybe it's a little bit different from academia because I think the companies like they focus more like I think they have a big budget to test several times, break the robot and try several times.
I think in academia, you'll see often they build the model and they simulate, someone kicking, introducing that type of disturbance. Whereas Boston Dynamics, they just went and kicked the robot.
Yeah, because the problem academia sometimes you have limited budget. I think Boston Dynamics have very huge budget.
Yeah, they can build.
That's why they can build and break and build again. They have no problem.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's go ahead with Joseph's presentation. Thank you.
No problem. Can you all hear me? Everyone's still awake? I wake up at 4 a.m., so I'm used to going to bed right now. So I'm going to try to like actually be awake for this discussion, make it interesting. Give me one more second. Cool. All right. So I'll go and introduce myself in a minute. That's on the second slide, but I just want to start with some initial perspectives I have on humanoid robots in general, which may converge, may be slightly dissident from you and this panel. First of all, I think it's a compelling technology. The idea of creating robotics that emulate the way that we move through our world is something that has captivated us in cinema and in sci-fi forever. And as we look at Figure 2 and what Tesla's putting out, there is an eeriness in how close it is to iRobot and things that were CGI in the past. So I do think it's becoming interesting as it becomes more and more technically feasible when you look at large language models and how that allows us to train these robotic systems quicker, as well as advances we've made in motors and how much smaller and stronger they can get. We're close in many capacities, which causes us to get optimistic too quickly or also pessimistic and terrified too quickly at the same time. So the entire space to me is, again, compelling, carefully crafted. And I think there's a lot of potential for different contexts where these systems can provide value if they're customized appropriately for that context or that user case. And what I love seeing is just the diligence and persistence of innovation in this space for 40 years now. Where did you start? In the 70s was the first humanoid robot you showed? So 40 plus years that engineers and technologists have been progressing solutions in this space. So I think it's incredible. And I think now is just a season for visionaries to take it that much farther. When Musk puts his stamp on something, the world pays attention. And then the same with OpenAI and how they're funding Figure 2 and things like this. It's becoming really an opportunity to cast a crazy vision on where technology can take us. But at the same time, I have some hesitations on how far it can really go in the near future. Some opportunities, an area that I'm really interested in, and I'll provide more context on this, is called the innovation trifecta, where you're trying to triangulate a user unmet need technical feasibility and commercial viability. And a lot of times, I think the majority of startups fail because they're so focused on progressing the technology and finding something that's feasible that they lose sight of the context of the user and whether or not what they're creating provides legitimate value. And they also don't have the commercial strategy in place. They're not considering, how are you positioning these capital systems? How are you charging for it over time? How are you maintaining the systems? All the downstream things beyond creating a robot, that's where it gets very difficult. And working in Johnson & Johnson, which I'll get to, I've seen a lot of that pain point in our approach to robotics. And I think we'll see the same trends in humanoid robotics. So the other opportunities, I think telling stories around where humanoid robotics actually can go is important, and controlling the narrative, because there's so much fear swelling around AI and all these robots, doing a hostile takeover, all the things we've seen on TV. And I also want to discuss the sigmoid curve of adoption, if you're not familiar with that, which is how new technologies are adopted in the market, first by visionaries and kind of early people engaging it, and then how you break through to the mainstream actually leveraging robots, right? Well, we have humanoid robots in every home. I don't know when that will occur, right? So let's jump into it. So first of all, this is who I am. So Life of Joey Sosaki. This is my family. I have 4 kids. We recently relocated to Japan about 2.5 years ago, where I was directing front-end innovation for Johnson & Johnson. I've been a global medtech entrepreneur for about a decade, starting in a mechanical engineering background. I then progressed into design engineering, robotics controls engineering, and systems engineering. At the heart of Johnson & Johnson's ventures into surgical robotics, J&J's invested an undisclosed amount in these spaces in the multi-billions. And I was the 16th engineer working in these teams across multiple mergers. So I have the scars. I've seen a lot over the course of my career working across the ambiguous problem spaces and the volatile political landscapes that have shaped our play in surgical robotics. On top of that, I have a passion for diversity, equity, inclusion, and leading teams on a global scale where everyone has a seat at the table and can bring their best contribution. So when I moved to Japan, I actually led teams with people in the US, in China, Japan, all trying to understand what are the nuance of unmet needs in the Japanese market for surgery, as well as in Asia Pacific, and how do we innovate inclusively on behalf of all of these global clinicians. We see differences in their approach to surgery in Japan versus the US is kind of the clearest example that I came out for. In my personal life, I got 4 kids, a 7-year-old, 5-year-old, 3-year-old, and a 6-month-old now. He's growing up quick, Akio. He's still fresh and fun. We love him. And I've been a content creator for about 4 years, and I have a slide on that as well. So I've built a community of around 40,000 folks across YouTube and TikTok, where we welcome them into the frenzy of our world as we learn how to raise 4 kids in Japan. Quarter Japanese, I love music, and I do long distance running, even though I don't look like it. So I put a GoPro in my head and go run across Japan and live stream that on YouTube. And it's a lot of fun and I love it. Concerning my next, I recently exited Johnson & Johnson strategically. I was given an offer to go back to the US, which didn't fit for our family. So we've done our 13th move to actually stay here. And I'm working on brand management, executive coaching, and also potentially entering the startup ecosystem. So I have a deeply personal global perspective. Our family relocated 12 times over the course of 1 year to get to Japan with 3 kids. I will spare you the details of this. I did a very small TED talk on it at my kids' school if you want to find it on YouTube. But it was so challenging to come here during COVID for our family. But it gave me an appreciation for the journey that you take as a family, as an individual, and also for technologies. Like, I came out here to progress surgical innovation on behalf of global patients, and I get to then sit in the OR and meet Japanese surgeons and hear how our products aren't designed for them. And there's something really amazing about that that made the journey worth it for me. And I'm excited in my next as I do consulting to help other businesses also find those global fits that scale well from a technology perspective. By the way, the joy of this diagram, I drew this for my son who was 6 at the time of our relocation. And I just wanted him to understand where his PS4 would be. Initially, it was supposed to be 4 moves. It turned into 12. So it would go into a shipping container. It'd go on a boat across the ocean. And then eventually it would arrive after temporary housing into our current apartment. He actually waited a total of 11 months to get his PS4, and then he played Crash Bandicoot. So very character refining moment for a 6-year-old. All right, so some of my other work, I have two brains, a left brain and a right brain. For my engineering side, I've progressed robotic surgery, VR, AR, digital ecosystems in an engineering, global strategic marketing capacity. And I've done a lot of global leadership in Japan. And then on my creative brain, I've done around, now it's up to 1,800 short form pieces of content. So I do a lot of video content, a lot of speaking online. I've garnered a pretty large community, and I have multiple sub brands. One's focused on these sarcastic engineering videos. It's a lot of fun. The internet hates them and loves them at the same time. Dadbot is where I go running around Japan. And then I also do family friendly content as people come into proximity to my journey living here. So let's talk about actual fun science engineering things. So who has ever seen this curve before? Has anyone ever heard of the sigmoid curve of adoption? I anticipated 0. Oh, really? So what do you think it is? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for those of you who don't understand it, or if you're in the back and it's hard to read, although I think there's multiple screens, basically if you are progressing a new technology like cell phones, over the course of time, eventually you will progress from maybe 3% of early innovators and enthusiasts walking around the city with this giant brick cell phone in their hand, right? Which some of you were born, well, we don't have to go into who's old and who's not to remember that. And then you have kind of the visionaries, which are the early adopters that are actually really advocating for it. Think about the first people that use like the BlackBerry, and we're texting on that. And then eventually there's this chasm that's really difficult to actually cross over, where a technology becomes mainstream. Everyone has one, it becomes the common norm. And then eventually you have this late majority and skeptics that pile on downstream, right? You can take a picture of it. You can also Google, it's just called the sigmoid curve. This is why a lot of startups die, because they're trying to break into this market and push past the chasm, and things take time. Google Glass died because it couldn't cross the chasm, right? That's the clearest example. I think that my big question that I'm trying to answer with humanoid robots is, do they actually provide legitimate value to end users that is substantial enough and accessible enough that you can cross the chasm? And I think over the last 40 years, the answer is no. That's why we all don't have humanoid robots cleaning our houses, helping us take care of laundry and dishes. My son envisions a future where he wants that, but we're not there. One of these terms that I'm trying to coin is the innovation trifecta, where you have your unmet need, technical feasibility, and commercial viability. We can keep progressing the tech all day, but if we're not solving a legitimate unmet need, either in the labor market or in the home for end users, and we can't commercialize it in a way that's accessible financially, where people have the capacity to pay for it, you never cross the chasm. This is the same challenge Musk faced with electric cars initially. That's why he went for a premium market with the S and the sports car first, low volumes, get a couple people that are really enthusiastic innovators to adopt it before you start to scale down to the Model 3, right? On top of this diagram, I think brand also builds the perceptive of quality. So if you have an existing company with a strong brand and reputation, then people start to buy into the perceptive that this might actually cross over. Is the Vision Pro going to enable that for Apple? We'll find out, right? Apple's name put on anything can push people into behavior modifications, but you don't see everyone on the subway or the train wearing these, or everyone on a plane doing it. But some people who are enthusiastic are trying it, and maybe it becomes normal. Maybe it won't, right? So the brand has a lot of power in this space as well. The reason I share that is I'm going to go through a case study with surgical robotics, and we'll tie it back into humanoid robotics. So this is kind of my world. Robotic surgery. This is an awesome platform that's commercially available today called Monarch. I didn't develop it. It was acquired by Johnson & Johnson, but if you want to watch some really cool surgical robotics, this basically goes into your body endoluminally through a natural orifice down your throat. And then it has bending robots that an end effector that allows you to do biopsies for cancer inside your lung. It's fantastic. I've connected with the team that developed it in some capacity. But I want to go through where the surgical robotics market has evolved, and I want to do it backwards. So I want to start at where robotic surgery is going, and then you can imagine the same situation for humanoid robotics. In 2020, 29, it's projected that the robotics market will be around 33 billion in USD. So it's a huge untapped market for robotic surgery in general across orthopedics, laparoscopic, so cancer anywhere on your body, right? This is the world I live in. We have a 16% CAGR, which is pretty high for technology space. And then if you look at the market today, it's around 16 billion. The largest player is called Intuitive Surgical. If you're familiar with the Da Vinci robot, Google it. They have multiple generations of that platform. It's a fantastic competitor that I've developed against in some capacity. Right now, there's around 24 plus companies in this space. You have 3 large med tech companies, Johnson & Johnson being one of them, Intuitive, Medtronic's another one, and then lots of smaller players are starting robots to kind of segment the market the best that they can. But the majority of these companies will fail or be acquired, and J&J or someone else will put their stamp on their offering. And this is where we get into kind of Johnson & Johnson's situation. So overall, their medtech business has done about 30 billion in sales in 2023, but all of their handheld surgical tools, which is where I started working on before moving to robotics, all of that market's being cannibalized as each patient or each procedure is starting to move towards a robotic offering. Robotic surgery is becoming more normative. In the beginning, we actually advocated against it, showing that it didn't have any clinical benefit to doing the surgery robotically. It actually added more time and more cost. What we didn't factor in was the ergonomic benefits of it. A surgeon could relax and sit and control the robot versus being hunched over the patient all day. So there are different drivers that led to the adoption of the technology that pushed it across the chasm. The reason I go through all this, and I'll run it quickly, J&J has had 3 large acquisitions in the robotics space over the last 4 years. I've worked across 2 of these companies. I was the 16th engineer in this space. It took them a decade of waiting for the market to shift to enter it as a strong player with a strong brand. Historically, they had the opportunity to acquire and they passed. They said it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the game in any way. Intuitive's now worth like 171 billion because they broke past the chasm. They had a very aggressive sales force. They lobbied heavily for the government to reimburse and change how procedures were actually paid for so that they could sell their robotic system. And actually adoption in Japan was very slow because Japan didn't see any additional clinical value to doing a surgery robotically until recently. Now they're opening up different surgical indications in the thoracic space or your colon or things like that, where these procedures can now be reimbursed, which means there's huge transfer of surgeries from handheld manual or analog into the robotic application. But J&J comes in, or these competitors come in now that the chasm's been crossed by one, and we're all building into the market together. The market will continue to grow now that it's becoming more normative as an approach. The reason I share all this is that I think the future of humanoid robotics will go to the company that actually centers their trifecta. The company that can legitimately progress the technology, meet a legitimate unmet need, whether it's in labor or for consumers, and hit the right price point where they can commercialize it, where you can lease a robot for $300 a month and it does all of your household cleaning and cooking. And it's connected with the right brand. Once one breaks through, the rest will follow, the market will expand. So I'm like pessimistic and optimistic. I think that's my big punchline. Did I have another slide? That's all I got. So Q&A. Do we have any time for Q&A?
Yeah, we have time. Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Of course.
Does anybody have any questions for Joe? Oh, yes.
So you mentioned this concept, chasm and this connecta. I was wondering, like, at least from the surgical robotic perspective, what do you think in terms of like what improved so that it was able to have an example of something that didn't cross the chasm? How can you cross? How do you know what's going to succeed?
You don't. I mean, with any technology, you really don't know what that defining moment of crossover occurs. Like when Steve Jobs presented the iPhone, that crossed a chasm, right? That destroyed BlackBerry, which had the majority of the market. For robotic surgery, what was unexpected was a lot of hospitals started purchasing these large capital systems, which at the time were like 1.4 million USD. I don't know how to turn that into yen in my head. But they started acquiring these robotic systems so that they could advertise on billboards the first robotic system in California for surgery, the first robotic system in San Jose, California. Like they started advertising down to the county, the state, the county. So it became almost a status to bring people into their hospital networks to be on the leading edge of surgery. So that was one of the first breaking points of actually people acquiring the technology and leveraging it in procedures. The second one, though, was kind of the legislation on what procedures had enough data to support charging a premium for them, because surgery is very cost prohibitive depending on which market you're in. Japan caps how much you can get paid for a certain procedure, even if your technology costs more than the cost of the procedure, then the customer or the hospital network takes that cost. So a lot of hospitals can have to limit how many robotic procedures they have in order to have that status, but also maintain profitability until the insurance and the government allows you to charge more of a premium. So that was part of it. J&J waited, as well as other players, because they wanted Intuitive. I don't know if wanted is the right word. They were allowing Intuitive to break across the chasm until we experienced enough hit on our revenue of losing millions every year from all these converted cases that we also had to take the jump and develop a system. That's why you see a race for humanoid robotics, because the hardware is getting so close and the AIs progress so much with large language learning models that should NVIDIA be developing a solution in this space? Does Apple need to have a humanoid robot? Does Tesla? Like, eventually that will also be a differentiator for your ability to manufacture quicker, and as well as if it becomes a consumer offering or an extension of your ecosystem of products. So I think that's why there's this humanoid race as well. But I can't predict when that chasm gets broken through and by who. Does that answer your question? Other?
Anyone have any other questions? Yes, in
Yeah.
the back.
Well, eventually, if we're for humanoid or for surgery? For surgery. So originally, Intuitive was funded. I mean, there's lots of VCs, but it was also with government contracts for telesurgery with the specific application of military. If you could have top tier surgeons out of the front lines and then have a robot in the battlefield that could actually do surgeries. And we've seen things like this in Prometheus and other movies, as well as like these autonomous robotic systems that could be teleoperated. That wasn't feasible when they first developed the tech because communication was 3G, 4G. At 5G, it's becoming more feasible. But if you imagine an instrument in someone's body near critical structures and you hit lag or latency, or the tool just continues a trajectory because it thought you were sending a signal and you're not anymore, the risk is very high. So for developing these robotic systems, we have to go through very strenuous testing and submit that to regulatory bodies that it will perform in an expected behavior. So I think that's why you haven't seen telesurgery as a commercial offering, because it's a very niche market compared to most surgeons are in the room. But if you could have more surgeons working remote and doing the procedure, that would be interesting. But in the event that the patient starts to flatline, like their vitals go down, they quickly leave the console scrubbing and they just cut someone open fully and recover, right? So that level of proximity, or at least having a surgeon proximal to the patient, is still critical for this application. But that's a good question. We're getting closer with cellular signal. Yeah. Do you have any kind of regulations or requirements you have to follow up? The government is saying what you can do for surgery? Yes. Yeah, we have some of the most strict regulations are in medical devices, and they're different between the EU, the US, and Japan. There's some crossover, and often we will either commercialize a medical solution based on a predicate device that we've innovated that's a faster regulatory path. For robotics, each system is so unique compared to a competitor that you have to do in-human clinical trials, which adds to the development timelines, as well as the testing you have to pass before you can get to that point. So one of the largest barriers to entry for robotics is the regulatory burden, the strenuous testing, as well as developing a system that performs as expected and doesn't become like a murder bot and drag the patient across the table. That's why so many of these smaller companies will fail. They just don't have the ability to develop the technology, progress the software, have it connected with a legitimate unmet need, be commercially viable, and navigate the regulatory hurdles. That's why you see only a couple med tech giants are really able to play well in this space or acquire a solution and quickly scale and commercialize it. Other questions? That's a great question.
So I got a question, I guess. You both touched on it a bit, with Tesla and OpenAI pushing humanoid robots for industry. How do you guys see that changing how your business runs, how you create value for what it is you want to offer to your clients?
Professor.
Yeah, I think like one of the maybe the approach by Tesla and OpenAI, because they want to experiment in a factory using this robot in a factory. I think this may be a good move because it's similar to what happened when this robot had been introduced 60 years ago for the first time. Because when you deploy a humanoid robot or any kind of device in a factory, because factory is constructed environment and also controlled environment. So in that case, you can limit the scenarios or the expectation of the robot performance. So the robot will be under control, and yeah, will be very limited scenarios. And also, if something goes wrong, it's surrounded actually by technical people who can deal with the problem. But if you want to maybe put the robot into public, like what like SoftBank had done, here like you have unlimited scenarios. You don't know actually how the people will deal with the robot. So I think maybe like Tesla, if they started testing the robot in a factory, maybe they have a chance to scale and test the robot. But if they want to use the robot in maybe in serving houses, maybe that could be very difficult because you don't know actually what's going to happen with someone who is not specializing with this technology.
Do you see, Joe, do you see any moves for humanoids in the med tech side of robotics?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of them. There's limitations as well. So one of the case studies we discussed is like Japan has a super aged population and an inverted population rate, like a declining birth rate. So that's one of the reasons I came to Japan, was to find opportunities for Japan's growing elderly population and surgical care. If you think about just one of the main things you have to do with elderly is pick them up and move them from one bed to another. But a lot of these humanoid forms that we're trying to create can't carry a payload more than 70 pounds, which for some Japanese BMI, that actually might be right on the limit of possible. But the humanoid form, when you adopt it into robotics, has different inefficiencies. Our muscles and bone structure carries load different than rotating motors. So in order to make a beefier robot to carry that load, it's not going to feel fully humanoid. So part of it's understanding the application. But if you've made robots that could walk through the OR and help move patients and prepare them for surgery, or if you had robots that had GPT functionalities that could do talk therapy with patients and help them with their expectations, I still think that would freak people out if a robot's talking to me instead of a person to prepare me for surgery. That's not normative, right? That's still on the other side of the chasm. Maybe some people would think that's cool. Most people are concerned that they're going to get half their lung resected. They don't want a robot to talk them through the process. So I think there's pieces where it fits, where you could have humanoids come alongside clinicians and provide support. The best cinematic example we have is Jarvis is able to infer what Tony Stark needs as he's innovating. I think having intelligent humanoids supplementing what clinicians need from a decision-making perspective is interesting. A lot of medtech companies are playing in the digital ecosystem of preoperative planning, intraoperative decisions, and then postoperative care. And if you actually had someone walking around facilitating decisions, that's a robot, that's kind of neat. That's fun to think about. But could you also just provide that context on the screen they're looking at for surgery? Do you need a full present human fitting in that space or not? So it's worth exploring for sure.
Yeah, that kind of brings us to something both of you touched on as well. like the concept of the robot, like how do we adopt robots in our lives? If you think of, we go back to cartoons and sci-fi. So you showed Astro Boy. We can think of the Jetsons, you know, or even before that, when you get, you know, you showed robots from the 70s, and before that we had, you know, Flash Gordon and 70s Star Wars. So where do we get to the point where we can accept robots doing these tasks that humans would usually do? Or like what do you think is the type of I guess like the front end that allows us to say, oh, this can be done by a robot?
Okay, I think one of the biggest challenge in the humanoid world, because when people think about robot, they always think about the human. And I think the science fiction movies played a lot in making that image, because if you see like a lot of science fiction movies, they show like a robot just like a human. And sometimes like uh, Hollywood, especially like the Terminator movie, they shows actually the scary image about the robot would be harmful to human. So I think like when people like they have a humanoid, they always think that okay, this robot can do almost everything like a human can do. But the reality is very different because a technology have very limited performance. And when like the company sometimes they present a humanoid and they show it like in the real world, actually there is a mismatch between people's expectation and the real like technology, and that's why it's becomes very hard for companies, because sometimes they want to develop a humanoid and they want to put almost everything in that robot, and becomes almost very difficult to make. Even if they make it very advanced, like what Honda have done, they make the robot very advanced, but at the end, it cannot have real application or very limited performance. And that's why, like, until today, I think the expectation, there's a mismatch between people's expectation and the reality of this technology, which could be a real challenge for many companies right now.
Yeah, I think that's part of the chasm that you present. And so I've often thought about this problem as well, like how do we get people to accept that a robot is doing this work? And you know, at Telexistence, we started with humanoids working in convenience store, and we had sometimes people or kids come in and they look through and say, oh, there's a robot in the back doing the work, right? And in Japan, like you see a robot doing work, it's fine, right? Pepper was here and people accepted Pepper as a front end, and now we see robots going into the back end of work. So in Japan, that's great. So how do you see this type of mentality breaking into a Western culture? So like the US, for example, or in Europe or Middle East or Africa, where you're trying to bring this technology into uh, a place where maybe they don't imagine it to be part of their current culture or future.
Yeah, I could take a stab at that. So if we go through like a use case of me just on a quick financial exploration. So I forgot the name of the company. There's a Chinese company that's advertising that they could do a humanoid robot for 16,000 USD. So if you turn that into a car payment of around $300 per month, I would have, as a consumer, have to know that I'm getting at least $300 a month worth of value from that robot to consider leasing it and paying interest on it. We're used to payments. We're used to breaking something big like that into smallness and selling it. So like for me, because I'm a global med tech entrepreneur, I do content creation. I have 4 kids. I want to be proximal to them. Like we have a helper who shows up and helps us with dishes and laundry, and they float our kids a little bit with the child care perspective, and they cost more than that per month. I don't want to get rid of that person because I love them. They've been part of our family for the last 3 years, helping us navigate this transition. So it's not an immediate value transfer to have that load replaced by a robot, because there's also a connection and a trust. I don't trust a robot to help hold my baby while I'm on a Zoom call because everything's not working, right? Like I don't have that level of confidence yet in the technology and the integration. I still have concerns when Alexa hears things that I'm saying in my house that I don't want her responding to my kids a certain way. Like we always have a little bit of that hesitancy to what's happening with our data. And now that Alexa's walking around our home as a robot, if Amazon's working on one of these things, right, which they probably are, who knows? Like, I think you have to have someone who has the financial capacity to take on a third car if it's a two-car home already, that has enough need for time margin where they just don't want to cut the lawn and they need some help in the kitchen and they truly need a humanoid form to walk up and down the stairs and do these tasks. And you have to drive the cost down and trust the brand that's creating that technology and how it's responding with you. And I think to get that perfectly aligned for consumer versus an Amazon factory moving boxes is a different psychological consent is necessary there. I think early adopters would welcome it. Musk enthusiasts would welcome it, right? There will be pre-orders like crazy I don't know if they've already done that already, right? So I think there are certain people that will bring it into their life and others that need to see that there aren't news stories of the robot freaking out and dropping a child or grabbing a knife or all the things that we think ChatGPT can go off the rails on when you ask it questions. What's it going to do with a body in our house? Like that's a real thing that has to be tested and proven. And it's open AI. So it can move in unbounded ways at times. I don't know if you have thoughts in that space. I don't know if I'm scaring people or encouraging them more. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Maybe we can take one more question. We're almost done with time. I think, yeah, your hand up first.
So, based on your
Okay. Yeah, actually, I just did professor. There is a one professor. He used to work in the Tokyo State of Technology, Professor Hirosa. He's one of the famous robotics professor, and he was mainly against humanoid. He was one of the like professor always against humanoid. I think that this kind of technology is just waste of time, and he just encourage researchers to focus more mainly in robots that can do specific application. And there was a disagreement, of course, with other professor who thinks that humanoid maybe have some advantage, and they could prove like maybe humanoid is a way to understand our human body more. And there is some application, especially like medical training. Some people like some companies they develop humanoid that can works in the like developing training devices. Like if you have a device that looks like a human, you can train medical student, and that's why like there is a lot of debate between researcher and developers. They think okay, humanoid maybe have some advantage, but from my point of view, I think that okay, humanoid we should not focus just only to make a robot look like human. We have to focus more on the application. We can start by developing a humanoid, but if you think that in terms of application is not effective, we can change the design based on our experiment. And this, I think, the advantage. We can start as humanoid for the beginning, but we should not just focus at having humanoid as a shape at the end. That's why.
Yeah, and to build on that, like if you look at Boston Dynamics' new Atlas, the little video of the way it stands up from the ground with like full 360 hips, it's why did they do that? right? Like, why did they film it that way? Because anyone seeing a robot get up that way immediately links it with horror. Like, it shouldn't bend that way. But from a functionality, it can access and move in ways that are probably more helpful and augmented than my hips don't bend all the way backwards, right? When I want to get off the ground. So combining like the task you're trying to accomplish in the most efficient mechanism with an aspect of humanoid, I think getting that magic right, because there's a little bit of eloquence in the actual like the GUI, like how the robot emotes. Like you've done real faces. We're seeing like figure 2 has little dot faces or ways that it can kind of express things. How much of it is a robot? How much of it is humanoid? Finding that threshold, I think, will continue to be a mix of sci-fi and reality in the current world we live in. And people are drawn to that form because we're creating technology in our likeness, and our world tends to work for us. If the robot comes into our house on wheels, it can't get up our stairs. So there's certain like efficiencies that do come from it when you're trying to integrate into everyday people's lives. But if you're looking at having it run for 20 hours a day, progressing some kind of factory situation, it should not have a fully humanoid form. It should be some kind of hybrid. Like there's one with the knees bending backwards so that it can move heavier loads more efficiently. You have to find that balance of design and how people receive that design as well as function. But I think we'll always kind of revert towards human because we're getting as close as we can to what we've seen over the last decades and imagined. It's fun and scary at the same time.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank again Joseph and Ayman. That's today's presenters. So let's give them a round of applause. And that's it for our event tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Nico and one of the organizers for Robotics X Tokyo. All right, have a good night.